Education is brought to you by Discovery Channel School, a leading provider of quality educational resources that help teachers bring the world to their students.
Consider this before viewing Discover Magazine, Archaeological Detectives. How do investigators collect, store, and analyze evidence from a crime? Observe the procedures for excavating and studying human remains. Focus on the forensic anthropologist and the investigative tools of this profession. Assignment Discovery now presents Discover Magazine, Archaeological Detectives.
On a hot August day in 1989, a workman was called to a house in the town of Barrington, Illinois. An underground water pipe was leaking, and it had to be dug up before repairs could begin. What the workman was about to uncover would shake this community to its core. After a few minutes, something in the dirt caught the operator's eye. He called the sheriff, who called the coroner.
Coroner's office, Marlene speaking. 99.9% of the time when we get called on found bones, it's usually somebody's dog that was buried in the backyard, or maybe a deer that got hit by a car and then went off someplace and died out in the woods or whatever.
Lance didn't know it, but the case she had stumbled upon would eventually lead back in time to the early 1960s, when a family with the name Masters started to break apart.
My childhood was fairly typical. I had two brothers, and we fought over everything.
But for Marianne Masters, life would soon change forever. Her father was moving out, taking her brothers with him to a new home in nearby Barrington.
It was the day after Thanksgiving, 1961, and I had just turned 15. And my brother was 14 at the time. And that was the last time I saw him, the day my father came to pick him up.
Marianne soon tried to contact her father and brothers, but it seemed like they had vanished without a trace.
I tried calling, but it just was a message that the number was no longer in service.
Is not in service. This is a recording.
All Coroner Lance had was a skull. She wondered if she had come upon Native American burial ground.
How's it going? Not too bad. Very good.
But she couldn't rule out murder.
How you doing? Very good.
So she called in her old friends, Hayden Baldwin and Melvin Trojanowski, crime scene archaeologists. The men noticed something else that would have been missed by all but the most experienced observers.
You can see right here there's a depression. Okay, obviously here by the way I can get my hand under here. So if
The
we have
depression in the earth
part of the
suggested
skull
that
or top
something
of the
had
body
settled
here,
underneath the surface. The next step for the archaeologists is to systematically excavate the area. Working only with hand shovels, the men begin the back-breaking process of removing soil.
you still see that depression. It's very heavy there.
They first carefully remove the grass cover.
There you go. Got it?
Then they excavate in 6-inch layers, keeping the soil from each layer in separate piles.
Marlene, we got another bucket here. Let me get some of it here for you.
Nearby, Marlene sifts the soil, one layer at a time. Mary Ann couldn't locate her father or brothers for years. Eventually, she tracked down another number. Her father's voice calmly answered.
It's Mary Ann.
When she asked to speak with her brother Butch, her father told her that Butch had left that September for Alaska to work in the lumber industry.
The season for working in the lumber industry in Alaska was April to October. It was that way in 1964, and it's that way today. You just don't work in the lumber industry in the winter. I mean, it's frozen.
Trying to get leveled out here, Mel, but oops, wait a minute. What's this?
2 feet down, Hayden hits something.
Okay, we're down past the point of using a shovel now.
Now, the men don rubber gloves as a safeguard against possible infection. They switch to more delicate tools. They work carefully and deliberately, using the techniques of field archaeology. The idea is to expose the find completely before moving it. Any shift in position would distort the evidence and possibly destroy valuable clues. What the investigators suspected from the beginning has been confirmed. A complete skeleton, undeniably human, lies buried in a shallow grave. Mary Ann couldn't understand why her brother would move to Alaska and never call her. She began to search for him.
I searched just about everything in the state of Alaska. Hunting licenses, fishing licenses, court records. I called the clerks of the court. I called Information in Alaska. I called the reference librarian in the Juneau Library, and I asked her to check all the phone books for the state of Alaska. They told me there was no listing.
Mary Ann searched for her brother for 25 years. In that time, she got married, had a family, and moved to another state, but she never gave up looking for Butch.
I'm trying to access death records for the state of California. Well, I don't know.
She checked voter registration lists, prison records, and death lists in 40 states and Canada.
I understand, but I'm trying to find my brother.
She finally persuaded the Social Security Administration to check their records. If Butch had ever held a job, his name would almost have to be in their files.
They had no record of my brother. It was just like a one-sentence thing. They had no record of my brother after the last date in 1964 that I had seen him.
The archaeologists had exposed the entire skeleton. Now they drew on their years of experience to interpret what they saw.
Arm over there next to his body. He's kind of laid out here. We got him completely uncovered. What do you think?
One thing surprised them. They found no clothing in the grave.
No elastic from shorts, no zipper from jeans. We found nothing, which would indicate to us that this body probably was not wearing anything when it was buried.
The position of the body provided another clue. Whoever buried this person was probably a family member or a close friend.
His left one's kind of bent over here.
The way the body was laid, somebody who would be non-familiar with this person wouldn't be so careful. They took care in laying this body out, almost like it was their own burial for somebody they knew.
It wasn't much to go on. Without further evidence, it would be next to impossible to identify this skeleton. The investigators would have to take the bones back to the morgue to see if they would yield any further clues. Medical examiners typically work with cadavers. Their soft tissues, the skin and internal organs, are usually intact and often reveal the cause of death. A bare skeleton presents a harder problem. So Coroner Lance decided to call in an expert.
Hi, Dr. Small.
Hi,
Good to see you.
How you doing?
She
Good to
called
see you.
world-famous
How are you right now?
forensic anthropologist Clyde
Good,
Snow.
good. Have a seat, please. I've got some pictures here just to give you an idea of. This farm belongs to
Snow
Richard
spends
Duchess,
most of
who's
his
the owner
time
of
studying the
Arlington Park
bones of
Racetrack. This is
genocide
like a
victims
huge
all
estate
over
out
the
there.
world.
Anybody missing?
No one is missing.
He also consults with
what we're
medical
wondering
examiners
about, we
on
know
bones
that, like the Helen
cases.
Brock case with the horse people and everything.
Where are the bones right now?
We've got them here in the back room. You want to go back?
Let's go take a look at them.
Okay, let's go.
do it.
The bones have been thoroughly cleaned and marked with case numbers. The skull, broken by the backhoe, has been glued together. The human body has over 200 bones. For Snow, each of them has a story to tell.
These bones really are the witnesses. They're telling us about who they were and how they died. They speak pretty softly. In fact, they speak so softly we have to listen with our eyes instead of our ears.
Snow first lays the bones out in anatomical position. Their general condition reveals clues about how they lived. For instance, was this person sedentary or athletic? Well-fed or malnourished? Robust or sickly? The size and shape of some bones indicate the skeleton's sex. For example, in males, this notch in the hip bone is smaller than in
The
females.
sciatic notch is very narrow.
Males also have a broader, more protruding forehead than females. These characteristics clearly indicate to Snow that this skeleton is male. As the forensic experts did their work, Detective Chuck Terrell was heading up the investigation. His job was to find unsolved missing person cases that he could match to the skeleton.
The television media picked up the case. At the time, it was widely publicized here in the northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin area, to see if we could find anybody that could give us a lead as to who this individual might have been.
But the stories never reached the one person who could have given the investigators a real lead. Mary Ann Masters, now living in another state.
For somebody that might have been there as far back.
Meanwhile, Snow and Lance continued to study the skeleton.
Measure the femur here.
How tall was this male? By measuring the leg bones, the femur and the tibia, Snow can determine the height of the living person. It turns out that this male was on the short side, about 5'4". How old was he when he died? Here, bones also have a tale to tell.
This ridge across here, it's not fully united to the body of the bone.
As bones grow, their ends remain open to accommodate new tissue. At maturity, the ends fuse and the gaps disappear. These unfused edges mean this person never reached maturity. So what did they have? A 5'5" male who died in adolescence. But what killed him? Here, the trail went cold. There were no bullet holes or blunt force fractures, nor were there any nicked ribs, evidence of stab wounds.
Nothing there. Well, wait a minute now. What's this?
Snow did notice a rust-colored stain on the right femur. It was dried blood.
Maybe a sign of an old injury.
But the injury was small and partially healed. It couldn't be the cause of death.
Well, how much was that?
By now, Terrell's investigation had also hit a dead end.
Goodbye now. The leads dwindled out. Everybody that we knew had been contacted and asked for information, and assembling all that information had led us nowhere.
With no leads, Lance and Terrell were forced to turn to other cases. The bones were boxed up and placed in storage, where they would sit silently for 5 long years.
I was very naive. I just assumed that we would have this person identified in no time at all. And then I started to think, we're never going to identify this guy. Never.
1994. A lifetime of searching had yielded nothing. But Mary Ann couldn't let go. She decided to begin again at the place where Butch was last seen, Barrington. She wrote to an old friend, Thomas Brandstratter, who knew Butch from school and still lived in the area. Brandstratter started calling old friends to see if any of them had ever heard from Butch.
It is? Geez, I haven't seen him since high school.
During one call, the man's daughter overheard the conversation.
And she mentioned that when she was in high school at Barrington in the late 80s, she remembered a story about some bones that were found. Next time I was downtown, I went into the library where they have the archives of the Tribune, and I got on the computer, put skeleton, bones, and after a few minutes, up popped 4 or 5 stories. The description of the skeleton was 5'5", 15 to 16 years old. I couldn't believe it. That described Butch Masters.
Brandstratter immediately called the sheriff's office. Now that he had a real lead, Terrell began scouring county archives for any records on Butch Masters. And now, Terrell turned to focus on the last person who had seen Butch alive, his father, John Masters.
Hello, Mr. Masters. This is Lieutenant Terrell from McHenry County. He told us the same basic story that he'd been telling everybody else for the last 30 years.
Masters told Terrell the Alaska story. Terrell was suspicious, but he couldn't prove Masters was lying unless he could show that the skeleton was Butch. The best way to do that was through DNA analysis. Teeth from the skeleton were sent to a DNA lab in Chicago. Teeth are a good source of DNA because the hard enamel acts as a protective shield. First, the tooth is supercooled with liquid nitrogen to make it brittle. Then it is ground up. The ground-up tooth is added to a series of enzymes that cause the DNA to precipitate out. This substance is pure DNA. The skeleton's DNA would be compared with DNA samples submitted from Butch's father and mother. If they matched, it would confirm that the skeleton was Butch. But in the meantime, investigators had made another crucial find. A hospital record dated 6 months prior to Butch's disappearance showed that Butch had been injured in an automobile accident. According to the report, the passenger side door handle had punctured Butch's right thigh. That would explain the stain that Dr. Snow found on the femur. Since blood contains iron, it rusts, leaving a permanent discoloration.
This specific little lesion was enough to tell me they'd got Butch.
Once again, Terrell questioned John Masters.
I told him, John, you must have thought about this event, many times in the last 30 years. And he says, yes. He says, I have thought about it. And I said, we still don't know exactly how Butch died. I believe that you could help me in telling me the manner and cause of the death of your son. And his remark was, well, you didn't find any bullets or broken bones, did you? And at that point, I knew that John Masters knew how Butch died and how he got buried there, and that it really was Butch. Mr. Masters, could you state your name?
John Earl Masters.
In a final interview, Masters confessed. He said that in 1964, he and his son had been arguing. One day, the argument got physical. His son shoved him, and he shoved back. Butch stumbled and fell down a flight of stairs.
Why didn't you call the police?
Within minutes, he stopped breathing.
I panicked. Maybe there were feelings of guilt. I just didn't. I don't have an explanation.
Masters decided to bury his son behind the house and make up the story about sending him to Alaska. None of the investigators believe they got the full story. But without witnesses to contradict his story, John Masters couldn't be convicted. Masters was allowed to plead guilty to manslaughter. He received 5 years probation and a fine of $1,700.
Basically, all they had was his statement. And there is an axiom in the law that you cannot be found guilty on a confession alone. As he was the only witness, that's all they had.
Mary Ann's search for her brother is over. But she may never find the answers to the most difficult questions.
How do you put your son in the backseat of his car, cover his body up, and wait until that night to go out and dig a grave? How did it feel when he put that first shovel full of dirt on top of his son?
Keep watching. Discussion topics and activity and resources for Discover Magazine. Archaeological Detectives are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Discover Magazine, Archaeological Detectives, talk about this. What steps did scientists take to collect, store, and preserve the bones of the unidentified skeleton? Discuss the clues the skeleton provided while in the ground and later assembled in the lab. What did scientists hope to discover by examining each bone closely? Now try this. Suppose you're going to interview a forensic anthropologist. Make a list of the questions you would ask. Create a class list of questions. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Discover Magazine, Archaeological Detectives. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests the forensic files, clues,